of the reasons increasing and briefly discuss some of those theories, although that will be explored more in a future video. We will look at some of the treatments for ADHD and discuss if we should use them or not. And we'll also touch upon some of the ways in which we can maintain deep focus with the lessons learned from ADHD. So first of all, the brain. It develops through our lifetime, with the greatest amount of development happening during the first few years of life, with the brain increasing approximately threefold from birth to age 4 years old. The development of the brain is not just about getting bigger, though. It's more about wiring it up and connecting it with each other properly. The brain is a computer, and different parts or regions are responsible for different functions. If one goes down, the system may not work as usual. The regions develop at different rates, with the ones that are responsible for the higher cognitive functions, also known as executive functions, developing later on, not being fully matured until at least 25 years old. This region is called the prefrontal cortex and is found right behind the forehead. A very recent study from the University of Oxford has actually suggested that our brains do not reach full maturity or adulthood until the early 30s, which makes me feel a bit better about myself, as I'm approaching that age and don't feel fully developed just yet. Executive functions are higher order functions controlled by the cerebral cortex. They are listed on the screen, and we'll be focusing on the prefrontal cortex as a part of that below. Executive functions are very important and separate us from other species, and indeed separate us from children when we are adults. They enable us to plan, prioritize, manage our time, organize, and plan ahead. Perhaps most importantly, they allow the regulation of our emotions in response to change and regulation. Together, they allow a sense of cognitive flexibility. This is the ability to change and adapt in many situations, and thus enable our functioning in life. The cognitive flexibility is found to be lower in those with depression, and indeed is something that can be much lower in those with ADHD as well. There are a number of different neuropsychological tests for executive function. These are shown on the screen right now. These include the Wisconsin card sort, to look at rule changing and our ability to adapt to changes in rules. The Tower of Hanoi, to test planning ahead. The Stroop test, which we may recognize from brain training games on the Nintendo DS, and the NBAC test, to test for working memory. Each of these will require the networks involved in frontal cortex to be in good working order and can be used to assess for executive function. It should be noted that ADHD is not actually diagnosed using these tests at all. These can merely suggest some symptoms may be present, and may be looking at those individual symptoms. One may be good at these tests and have ADHD, and likewise people may be bad at them and not have ADHD. ADHD is diagnosed via the DSM or ICD guidelines alongside many questionnaires, reports, and interviews with the patient to get a more holistic picture of the individual's life, as it is a very complex condition. Now we're going to have a little look at some of the neurobiology of ADHD. On the screen, we've got an fMRI scan showing blood flow to regions of the brain that are activated during a task. In this case, the patient is performing some of those tests that we mentioned on the previous slide. This individual has got less blood flow to the prefrontal cortex and thus may have poorer performance on these tasks. This is because the prefrontal cortex has got reduced function and reduced activation within ADHD. Now, the prefrontal cortex has long been known to be at the heart of personality and behavioural issues. Perhaps the most famous neuropsychological patient of all, Phineas Gage, demonstrated this. Gage damaged his brain during an accident with an iron rod passed through his skull right above his eye. Amazingly, he survived, but was left with changes afterwards, which describes with those around him describing him as being animal-like in nature and vulgar. He could not hold a job anymore, and his personality was profoundly changed. The rod went straight through his prefrontal cortex, and this is thought to have caused these changes in behaviour. The prefrontal cortex is not damaged this way in ADHD. The prefrontal cortex, however, does not develop fully or as well in ADHD, and therefore not able to connect to and wire to the other emotional areas of the brain, and this may explain some of those consequences. We're going to explore a bit deeper now the biological reasons for ADHD. It is not the only reason involved in ADHD. Regions don't tend to work in the brain alone. They communicate with other regions in what we call network. One important network within ADHD is the default mode network, and this is associated with being idle, the concept of the self and self-reference. It is activated when we are daydreaming and doing nothing. Default mode network contains the regions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the lateral parietal lobe. We can think of the DMN in the case of ADHD as the demon. It interrupts us when we don't want it to. It is usually synchronized with another network, but in ADHD, it is not as well synchronized. Interestingly, ADHD-like symptoms can be seen in those sleep-deprived or those who have been on screens for a long period of time. The other network that we are going to look at, which is of interest within the brain, is the task-focus network, and this is involved in goal-oriented behavior. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex. Normally, in those with ADHD, the task-focus network and the default mode network are mutually exclusive or anti-correlated. In other words, when one is switched on, the other is switched off. However, in the person with ADHD, the default mode network and task networks are actually more coordinated and will interrupt each other when not intended. This biological change underpins some of the symptoms that we see with ADHD. Where the difference in wiring between these networks actually originates, though, is a source of a lot of debate and is less clear, and we will touch upon that later. People who improve their ADHD tend to see a better anti-correlation between the default mode network and the task focus network, as shown in MRI scans showing those who have been taking ADHD medication. The neurotransmitter dopamine is people with ADHD tend to have lower dopamine levels or dopamine sensitivity in their brain, especially in these regions discussed. So it is extremely important, however, it's not fully clear as to whether it's low dopamine or low sensitivity. Indeed, there is likely a variation, and this may account for some of the subtypes of ADHD or the different variety of symptoms. Either way, the main medications that we use tend to focus on increasing dopamine levels, and we'll talk about that more later. So now we've had a look at some of the biological roots of ADHD, we will explore it and how it can affect someone, but while linking back to the biology that we have just explored. So first of all, people with ADHD often have issues with timekeeping and procrastination. This is due to the brain circuits involved with perception of time not developing as usual, in conjunction with the fact dopamine levels are lower and interruptions between the default mode network and task focus network lead to lower motivation when it comes to starting or finishing tasks. People often delay starting their tasks, only to realise when they get going they're actually quicker with ADHD than a typical individual. Though this can sometimes be rushed and mistakes made while with details being missed. Finishing tasks or bridge projects can also be an issue with ADHD as a result of this tendency. Secondly, and classically looked for within boys, are impulsive behaviours, which can be a major issue for individuals with ADHD. This can sometimes be socially inappropriate. It's thought to be dopamine-seeking behaviours, though it can be looking for attention due to a lack of secure attachment in the parental environment, which we'll look at more later on. This can lead to many other issues in life, including isolation, socially, as peers reject them as a result of these inappropriate behaviours. Many people with ADHD struggle with deadlines, especially when they don't have a deadline given, and will often leave things to the last minute. Sometimes setting a time aside or boxing time can actually be a very good strategy for those with ADHD and anyone else, as it puts a bit of pressure on them to get it done in that certain time. People with ADHD often have poor planning, and this is one of the hallmarks of ADHD, either where people underplan a task and go straight into it without much thought, or the other side where they overplan and end up never getting anything done as they get stuck in a state of analysis paralysis. People with ADHD often have poor working memory. People forget what is said recently, even when it is said directly to them. This is especially common in settings where they are not immediately engaged, such as work meetings. This can lead to difficulties in other areas and lead to perceptions of laziness or stereotypes for those around them. The working memory issue can be as a result of some of the psychological basis of ADHD, where individuals may tune out as a result of emotional pain, and we will have a look at that shortly. Emotional regulation is extremely an issue within ADHD, and addiction to substances may be more common in those with ADHD, as they tend to seek out high dopamine to overcompensate for their low dopamine. This can be beneficial in the short run, however, in the long run, leads to major issues with lower dopamine levels, as well as all the other issues that addiction can face. People with ADHD are also more prone to sugar eating and therefore more prone to obesity. So that's all very well and good, and these symptoms that we have discussed are often more well known and well documented. However, they are often ones on the surface that are more. They are also often the ones that are on the surface and more obvious. There are more internal symptoms of ADHD and perhaps darker symptoms that people do not often discuss or even fully understand. I've recently read the book Scattered Mind by Gabor Mate, a physician with ADHD who has specialised in its psychological underpinnings. He gives the view that it's caused by a trauma response due to a lack of secure attachment and a chaotic environment at home between parents and between infant and parent. As a result, the child does not ever feel secure and often tunes out as a trauma response to temporarily numb the emotional pain. This trauma response becomes ingrained in the individual and often stays present in them for far longer after the fact, suggesting a developmental halt in emotional development and regulation. This may explain many of the symptoms that we have discussed so far in some way. Now, before I go into the psychological aspects more, it should be noted that some individuals within the fields are highly critical of this viewpoint, as it somewhat dejects the biological view, which many of the treatments have been based around. It also leads to a lot of blame on the parent and may place the individual in a state of victimhood. However, many practitioners take into account that medication to relieve dopamine should be used alongside psychological therapies, as it cannot overcome all of the psychological issues of ADHD. It may improve the symptoms, but it may not affect the root causes. So, beyond the typical symptoms of ADHD that we've just discussed, there are many psychological symptoms. First of all, low self-esteem, often as a result of difficulties in childhood, be that from parents not giving them a secure environment needed for proper development, higher adverse childhood experiences and stigma from others, and one self throughout the life of the individual. This is seen as a root of ADHD, and many of the other symptoms I will discuss link back to poor self-esteem. Poor attachment due to the chaos at home is common within ADHD, and this can cause issues in relationships and novelty seeking as a way to compensate for this never feeling safe. People with ADHD tend to be people pleasers due to these self-esteem issues. They may not assert themselves as they should, may keep their true opinions to themselves for the ease of not breaking the attachment pattern, not rocking the boat. They don't want to rub people the wrong way as they're used to being dejected. They are replaying the chaos that they may have had in childhood. People with ADHD may suffer with something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, where they end up processing criticism as a perceived rejection and a personal attack, leading to them to spiral as a result. As such, they may not ever try and get rejected in the first place and may keep themselves to themselves as a way of avoiding this pain. However, it only perpetuates a miserable cycle. Workaholism is extremely common in ADHD, as people with ADHD may see their work as the only way in which they can get validation and acceptance from other people, or because it reminds them of their childhood where their love may have been conditional and attached to their achievements. This often leads to feelings of emptiness and can explain why people with ADHD can appear as higher achievers but have a lot of internal turmoil. Anxiety and ADHD are very commonly comorbid with one another. 9% of people of ADHD have got a diagnosable anxiety disorder due to the racing thoughts and whirring mind sometimes not being the kindest, as well as all the other psychological symptoms making a milieu of discontent. Relational dysfunction in ADHD is extremely common. Self-sabotage may occur where the ADHD person feels insecure and tests the person to see if they will run away or not, playing out the insecure pattern after childhood with the primary caregiver. Alternatively, people with ADHD may find flaws or look for the exit within a relationship when there are no problems actually to be found due to the waning enjoyment due to low dopamine. They may also get bored easily and may be unfaithful as a result, or call it quits on something that is perfectly fine. Lots of self-sabotage is common. Sometimes the individual who is going out with an individual with an ADHD can end up being their caregiver, emotionally soothing the ADHD individual who is struggling to feel secure. They may end up taking on the lion's share of house chores, and this can be incredibly straining for both. Perfectionism is also a huge issue for those with ADHD and permeates into all of the other areas discussed. They want to impress and do things well, but can be incredibly hard on themselves when they don't. This ties into the other areas discussed, looking for the perfect relationship, looking for the perfect job. It can be a real issue with people with ADHD and lead to a lot of self-sabotage. All of these things together lead to a poor sense of self and one's feelings, and sometimes this can lead to tuning out. As a result, people disconnect from their own feelings as they're constantly trying to live up to what they feel others want from them rather than what they want for themselves, and they lose touch of that. This can lead to masking, especially in girls with ADHD, where they mask their symptoms to live up to what they think the norms of society expect. This can be massively exhausting and play havoc with self-esteem, as they are constantly pretending to be something else rather than embracing themselves. One of the main psychological approaches to ADHD treatment can be acceptance of oneself and feelings, and to avoid the burnout which is common in ADHD. So, let's go back to the medications. Many ADHD medications tend to focus on raising the levels of dopamine within the system. There are amphetamine classes of drugs, such as Ritalin, Adderall, and modafinil. All of these work to allow proper default mode network and task mode network functions. They can be similar to some drugs of abuse and have got the propensity to be abused. Adderall itself is extremely addictive due to the dopamine level surge that it causes. These medications should not be abused or used by people without ADHD. There is an alarming trend within universities where people try and get hold of these medications to use them for studying. However, they can be abused and have dire consequences as a result. People who do get prescribed them as to treat their ADHD should be issued by a clinician and should be adjusted over the lifespan with regular reviews. A process called titration is carried out where the person is slowly weaned on to find the ideal dose for them, and with regular reports of their side effects going on regularly with their physician. The lowest dose possible should be used alongside other potential treatments. There are a number of different treatments for ADHD, and these include mindfulness. This can improve the levels of focus, with published accounts within the literature showing that 15 minutes of mindfulness practice can reduce attentional blinks and help reduce cognitive decline. And this is helpful for all people, not just those with ADHD. There have been many stories as well about how diet can contribute to ADHD. The elimination of various foods that may trigger allergies via the oligo-antigenic diet may help reduce the impulsive behaviors that are seen from ADHD. Reducing sugar levels and consumption of sugar-high foods, which are often sought after by ADHD individuals to increase their dopamine, has also been found to highly reduce the ADHD-like symptoms. Another region of the brain which I've not mentioned so far is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in fine motor control, including balance, riding a bike, and fine motor coordination. Many people with ADHD are actually very poorly coordinated due to an underdeveloped cerebellum. And it has been found in some instances that practicing balancing exercises which help activate the cerebellum and act on that neuroplasticity and its ability to rewire can actually lead to reductions of ADHD symptoms by up to 90%. Now, why that might be is because the cerebellum itself acts as a bit of a conductor between the default mode network and task mode network, allowing better synchronization between them. It acts as a middleman, helping them coordinate properly. So improving that cerebellum through exercises of balance can be massively helpful for ADHD symptoms. Now, I've spoken a lot about how ADHD can be seen as a bit of a difficulty or a bit of a burden for people who have the condition. However, like other neurodivergencies, ADHD has got many perks that are associated with it that, when managed properly, can be harnessed and actually allow better performance in several areas. High energy and creativity are hallmarks of ADHD. People with ADHD often look at things from a different point of view and may approach things at a different angle, especially in areas that are interested in. They're able to harness that hyper focus. People with ADHD are often extremely resourceful as well and can do well under pressure as they're used to being stressed. Warm-heartedness and empathy are extremely common within ADHD. These people are extremely sensitive and are extremely used to feeling judged from themselves, however, can therefore lead to a lot of love and a lot of support and warmth for other people as a result. They're extremely easily forgiving because they're used to feeling ostracized by others and themselves, and they often have a good sense of humor and are very loyal people. Now, there are a few theories as to why ADHD is on the rise. I'm going to briefly talk about how technologies may contribute to ADHD-like symptoms. So things like TikToks and Instagram Shorts, etc., that are highly novel and often very short, provide a very quick hit of dopamine from the brain. They're also often high sources of motion, which the brain and the eyes are focused on and drawn to. And people will end up using them for hours at a time, losing track of time as if they had ADHD. People who are exposed to their screens for long periods of time often display more ADHD symptoms, partly due to the screens themselves and partly due to the effects of their sleep. Now, do these screens actually cause ADHD symptoms or actually cause ADHD to develop? Potentially, they may do so in adults who didn't have the symptoms as a child. However, it's unlikely that they actually cause the illness. However, not the illness, sorry, the condition. However, this is unlikely to be the case. Okay, and many other studies are investigating how the developing brain can respond to increased screen time exposure with worrying results. Now, one thing I will mention, okay, a few things I'll mention before we finish are some different techniques as to how we can manage our focus. Cold therapy has been massively on the rise recently, with findings showing how it increases dopamine and norepinephrine and other neurotransmitters involved in function following 2-minute exposures to the cold. And this increased levels of these neurotransmitters can persist for up to 4 to 5 hours. There are many other techniques and holistic ways in which we can improve motivation and focus, both for those with ADHD and those without. Improving our sleep hygiene is massively important, and this can be done through early light exposure and reducing the light at night. Non-sleep deep rest, which is similar to meditation. Exercise levels can also improve it as well. Nutrition has got a massive role to play, as we've mentioned, reducing sugary foods, but also increasing the levels of amino acids involved in dopamine synthesis, such as L-tyrosine, found in eggs, meats, and fish. Omega-3s may have an important role. Digital detoxes, while the research is not fully conclusive, reducing screen times may have an indirect impact on ADHD for improving sleep and allowing more sustained attention through reading instead, rather than having the constant flittering between different stimuli that screens often afford themselves to. Being specific with our goals and having a specific time span in which to get them done can also help focus the mind. Here are some of the references and sources of inspiration that I have for this session. I'm also undertaking a master's in neuroscience and psychology at the moment and have gathered a whole host of different knowledge bases. So I'm very happy to answer questions about ADHD and how it works if you're interested. Thank you very much. Until next time, this has been Brain, Biology and Beyond.